If you like our video, click the button to subscribe to our channel and get easy access to new content. To see our full suite of ad-free video courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides, visit us at www.teachucomp.com. The gradient tool in Photoshop lets you apply a gradient fill, which is a gradual blend between multiple colors to a pixel selection or to a raster layer. There are many preset gradients included in Photoshop, and you can also create your own gradients. You apply a gradient in Photoshop using the gradient tool by clicking and dragging within a selection or a layer. The starting and ending points of the area over which you drag is the location over which the gradient transition appears for all gradient styles except angle. This changes the gradient's appearance depending on which gradient style you select. The gradient tool in Photoshop lets you apply gradients either non-destructively or destructively starting in Photoshop version 24.5. Earlier versions of Photoshop only apply gradients to raster layers destructively. The new non-destructive version of the gradient tool in Photoshop also lets you adjust the gradient after applying it, unlike the classic gradient tool. To use the gradient tool in Photoshop, click the Gradient Tool button in the Tools panel. The Gradient tool shares the same button in the Tools panel with the Paint Bucket tool and deprecated 3D Material Drop tool, and the button shows the icon for the last tool selected. So, if needed, make sure you select the Gradient tool by clicking and holding down on this button, and then selecting the Gradient tool choice from the side menu that appears. To show a drop-down menu of saved tool presets for the Gradient tool from which you can choose, click the Click to open the Tool Preset Picker button at the left end of the Options bar control panel. The Gradient tool comes with one circular rainbow gradient tool preset, which you can use to easily apply a circular rainbow gradient. This is often used after selecting the sky in an image layer to quickly apply a rainbow effect to the sky. To select which version of the gradient tool to apply if using Photoshop 24.5 or later, select either Gradient to use the new non-destructive version of the Gradient tool, or Classic Gradient to use the older destructive version of the Gradient tool from the next drop-down to the right in the Options bar control panel. Note that your choice here changes the following options in the Options bar control panel. Also note that older versions of Photoshop do not contain this dropdown in the Options bar control panel and can only use the older destructive version of the Gradient tool. Then select where to apply the gradient by selecting the desired layer in the Layers panel. If you select a blank raster layer and then use the new Gradient tool, the selected raster layer is converted into a gradient adjustment layer and a layer mask is applied to it. If you instead select a layer with existing content in the Layers panel, then a new gradient adjustment layer and layer mask are added above the selected layer. Alternatively, if you don't select a layer in the Layers panel, the new gradient adjustment layer and its mask appear at the top of the layer stack. Alternatively, to select where to apply the gradient fill if using the classic gradient tool in Photoshop, select the raster layer to which to apply the gradient fill in the Layers panel in Photoshop. Optionally, then make the selection within which to apply the gradient fill in the selected layer. If using the new gradient tool, then the selection becomes the layer mask for the gradient adjustment layer. If using the classic gradient tool, Photoshop applies the gradient to the selected area in the selected layer. The default gradient pattern for the gradient tool is a transition from the current foreground color to the background color. However, the gradient tool remembers the last gradient pattern applied and shows it as the default choice when you select it later. To instead choose which gradient pattern to apply, click the Select and Manage Gradient Presets drop-down arrow button in the Options bar control panel to show the Gradient Picker panel. The Gradient Picker panel shows the preset gradient patterns in gradient groups which appear as folder icons. To show or hide the preset gradient patterns in a gradient group, click the arrow to the left of its name to expand or collapse its gradients. Custom gradient patterns you create and do not save into a gradient group appear individually at the bottom of the list of preset gradients. To select the gradient pattern to apply and close the Gradient Picker panel, double-click the desired gradient pattern in the Gradient Picker panel. After selecting a gradient pattern to apply, the pattern then appears in the Options bar control panel. Optionally, to create a custom gradient to apply if using the Classic Gradient tool, click the gradient pattern in the Options bar control panel to open the Gradient Editor dialog box, where you can create a custom gradient pattern, and then click the OK button to apply it. You will examine using the Gradient Editor dialog box in Photoshop in detail in the upcoming lesson titled How to Use the Gradient Editor in Photoshop. Note that you cannot open the Gradient Editor dialog box this way if using the New Gradient tool, but you can open it in other ways, and you can also edit the gradient after applying it, as you will learn in the next lesson titled How to Edit a Gradient Adjustment in Photoshop. To then select the style of gradient to apply for either version of the gradient tool in Photoshop, click either the Linear Gradient, Radial Gradient, Angle Gradient, Reflected Gradient, or Diamond Gradient button in the Options bar control panel. The linear gradient choice applies the gradient transition from the starting point to the ending point in a straight line. The radial gradient choice applies the gradient transition in a circular pattern from the starting point at the center of the circle to the ending point at the outer edge of the circle. The angle gradient choice applies the gradient in a clockwise sweep around the starting point and along the angle set by the starting and ending points. The reflected gradient choice applies the gradient over the starting and ending points and also applies a symmetric linear gradient on the opposite side of the starting point. The diamond gradient choice applies the gradient transition in a four-pointed diamond pattern from the starting point at the center of the diamond to the ending point at an outer point of the diamond. Also, note you can click these same buttons in the Options bar control panel to change the gradient style of a selected gradient adjustment layer after applying the gradient using the New Gradient tool in Photoshop. However, you can't do this if using the Classic Gradient tool. Instead, you must select a different gradient pattern and then reapply the gradient to the selected raster layer to change its pixels. To select the blending mode of the gradient if changing pixels in a raster layer using the Classic Gradient tool, select a choice from the Mode dropdown in the Options bar control panel. Additionally, to set the opacity of the gradient, click the Opacity dropdown and then use the slider that appears to set the opacity percentage or type of percentage into the opacity field. Note that these drop-downs do not appear in the Options bar control panel if using the New Gradient tool, as it applies its gradient adjustment in a separate adjustment layer. To reverse the gradient pattern for either version of the gradient tool, check the Reverse checkbox in the Options bar control panel. To create a smoother gradient with less obvious banding between the colors, check the dither checkbox. Like the gradient style, you can check or uncheck the previous two checkboxes for a selected adjustment layer created using the new gradient tool to immediately change it. Alternatively, if using the classic gradient tool, you must reapply the gradient to the selected raster layer after checking these checkboxes. Also, to enable transparency in the gradient pattern, if using the classic gradient tool, check the transparency checkbox. This checkbox is not available for the new gradient tool. To change the interpolation method applied to the gradient for either version of the gradient tool, select the desired method from the method dropdown in the options bar control panel. The perceptual choice is the default choice and interpolates the gradient using the OK Lab color space to better show a gradient that is perceived as natural by the human eye. The linear choice uses the linear color space to accomplish a similar result. The classic choice displays the classic Photoshop gradient interpolation and is also useful for backwards compatibility if needed. To apply the gradient using the gradient tool in Photoshop after choosing your desired tool settings, click and drag from the starting point to the ending point of the gradient or gradient transition, depending on your selected gradient style, within the layer or selection. Optionally, to restrict the gradient line you draw to either 15-degree angles for the new gradient tool or 45-degree angles for the classic gradient tool, hold down the Shift key after you click and drag to start drawing the starting and ending points of the gradient. When you release the mouse button, you then apply the selected type of gradient for your version of the gradient tool. If using the classic gradient tool, you apply the gradient destructively and must therefore change the settings in the options bar control panel and then reapply the gradient to adjust it, or use other pixel editing tools to adjust its pixel data. Alternatively, if using the new gradient tool in Photoshop, the gradient is applied as a gradient adjustment layer and layer mask and appears selected in the Layers panel after applying it. You can then adjust it in either the document window or within the Properties panel using the available gradient settings in either location, which is discussed in the following lesson titled How to Edit a Gradient Adjustment in Photoshop. Remember to click the subscribe button to see more of our videos. See our full suite of courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides at www.teachucomp.com.